Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Ethiopia in 1984.
The worst human disaster for a decade.
And in 2009.
And the harvest is ruined.
It's been 25 years since the famine, the story, then and now. More shots fired in the war between pro-Kremlin Russians and the Western media reporting that story. Newspaper circulation in America has been falling, and the situation is going from bad to worse. And politicians speaking and singing in harmony.
We must embrace a new era of engagement
For a change. We are devoting the bulk of this week's broadcast to a story that came out of Africa 25 years ago. And we're asking why it is that we are not seeing much of the same kind of news being reported today. The story was Ethiopia and the famine that killed 1 million people there. Millions more would have starved had the story not been reported in such a compelling way on Britain's BBC. One initial 7-minute story created a ripple effect in the global news media, resulting in one of the most successful relief efforts the world has ever mounted. But that's just about it for the feel-good factor. People are still starving, not just in Africa, but since that watershed report in 1984, news of famines and food crises often fails to make it onto our television screens or into print. Our starting point this week, the news report that helped save millions, its legacy for the media, and the question, if people starving to death aren't news in 2009, what is?
On the almost unbelievable horror of people without food, without hope.
The coverage of the 1984 Ethiopian famine was a hugely important media milestone.
Ethiopia, scenes of famine and death, now familiar to television viewers.
It definitely set a new standard for everybody because nobody had ever seen anything of this scale before.
A biblical famine, now in the 20th century.
When Bob Geldof saw that, something moved inside him to go and do Band-Aid.
And then Live Aid, and that meant that a whole lot of money that wouldn't otherwise have gone towards aid was able to get into Ethiopia.
The first emergency aid from Australia to famine-stricken Ethiopia leaves Melbourne tomorrow.
News editors could no longer ignore the fact that famine was something that people were interested in seeing about, were deeply affected by.
Or could they? One of the lasting journalistic legacies of the Ethiopia story was that it did set new standards of scale that subsequent food shortages could not possibly measure up to.
It sort of set the bar, and that became a challenge because we have many food shortages in Ethiopia over the years. The droughts now come in cycles quicker and quicker. And so what happened is we had to prep people ahead of time and say, look, you're not going to find those kinds of images, but yes, you're going to find starvation, you're going to find people that are thin and need food desperately, but it's not on the scale of what you were expecting.
Ironically, it made disaster coverage more difficult. Every news editor then asked a question afterwards, is this as big as Ethiopia? And that was something that journalists always had to consider.
If the disaster is big enough, the media will come. Martin Seemungle covered Ethiopia in 1984 for Canadian television.
The first thing you notice when you walk into this village is all the plowed fields.
Earlier this year, he did what not enough journalists do. He went back to the country to see what has been done there to prevent history repeating itself.
One of the things the media has to do more of is they've got to get in and do more of these stories that tell the story behind the story. They can't just go in whenever there's a crisis, because first of all, people go, well, where did that come from? Why is there a crisis? It comes down to agriculture, it comes down to irrigation, it comes down to electricity. They don't have any of those things. Why don't they have any of those things? Well, the question I have is, why isn't the media telling that story?
These crops should have been enough to sustain an entire family for about a year.
The media coverage has been more on the front end of the problem. Once famine has struck and once it begins taking the human toll. On the fact that these famines have other social, political and other historical problems has not been presented to the wider public. So this part of the coverage, the back end of it, has been missing.
That's something that I think we've all have learned. We have to be responsible, and we have to actually educate the media and hopefully bring in the media sooner, because what happens oftentimes is the media come when it's sort of too late, and they can play a very important role in sensitizing the world. So we have learned, I think, to try and utilize the media's interest earlier on get them in, help them raise the awareness of what could be an impending disaster.
And even when disaster strikes and people go hungry, food shortages, even famines, often fail to attract as much coverage as other humanitarian disasters, especially on television.
I think it's more difficult to get famines on TV than it used to be. I mean, if you look at the kind of coverage we've seen in recent times, it tends to be earthquakes.
Yes, the Indonesian authorities are really struggling at this time to cope with the scale of the disaster.
Tsunamis, floods.
A powerful tropical storm has dumped more than a month's worth of rain in just 12 hours, killing at least 240
You get very dramatic pictures of people
so far.
suffering, whereas the dreadful thing about famine is a lot of the time it's people warning in advance, this is what will happen, people will die if we don't do something to help it, but you don't get those very dramatic pictures until very, very far down the line.
And by then, it's too late. The trick for aid workers will always be getting the media interested, getting the aid before a potential humanitarian disaster becomes one.
Considering the global economic crisis and that it's going to be that much more difficult for people to commit to food aid, I think any coverage is going to be really valuable because it will highlight a problem that needs financial support from the global community.
Welcome back. We have breaking news. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake striking.
It's very frustrating that the media does have such a short attention span if they can even focus on a humanitarian crisis. We're using every tool that we have, video, all sorts of YouTube, all sorts of mechanisms to try and get the message out. We can't rely on the traditional media anymore.
The political situation here is now in a very dangerous deadlock.
For the international media, they will go where the big story is. That's the only budget that they have these days, is to cover the very big stories, not to come back and do continual follow-ups. Well, it's up to the African people to continually follow up the governments using the media and whatever other tools they have at their disposal. We have to find those solutions ourselves. We can't rely on the rest of the world to do it for us.
And African and other developing countries cannot rely on the global news media either.
Conditions are more desperate than
Too often, the cameras only show up when it's too late, when people are dying, when it's a news story.
A deadly cocktail of successive droughts, armed conflicts, and rising food prices has put the most vulnerable at risk.
Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of famines in the media.
In the early days of global television news coverage, famines were an entirely new phenomenon to those in parts of the world who had never seen inhuman conditions in such vivid and graphic terms. Hence, it was labeled a story worth reporting. But after 2 decades, the image of the desperate African child with protruding ribs and flies buzzing about does not evoke the same empathy and emotions it used to.
Have we had any progress from that point in time? And are we always going to see Africa through this prism of a famine? We have famine fatigue, it seems to me. Every other day you switch the news, there's something happening, and it seems it's like a little bit like Hollywood. We have to have something bigger and better to catch our attention now.
If you'd like to join our growing list of Global Village voices, here are 3 ways to let us know. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. You can go on Facebook and hook up with us through the Listening Post page there, or you can follow us through Twitter. Between Facebook and Twitter, we now have more than 3,000 viewers signed up. You can use any of those methods to find out what stories we're working on and how you can add your voice to the mix. We'll be going back to Ethiopia in the second half of the program, but first it's time for Listening Post Newsbites. Almost everything about the internet is multilingual. The search engines, web pages, and social networking sites all cater to people speaking different languages. But one thing that has up until now been the exclusive domain of the Latin script is website addresses, despite the fact that more than half of the world's 1.6 billion net users communicate in languages that use different alphabets. But all of that is set to change as ICANN, the global regulatory body, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, is set to open up the addresses to characters from other languages such as Arabic, Chinese, and Japanese. ICANN says that in the next month it will be ready to start receiving applications for new addresses, and that those addresses should be in use by the middle of 2010. There's a pro-Kremlin youth movement in Russia called Nashi, and it has taken issue with and legal action against Western news organizations. Nashi is suing 4 foreign newspapers for libel. Those papers, Britain's Independent, France's Le Monde, and Le Journal du Dimanche, and Germany's Frankfurter Rundschau, are all being taken to court for publishing an article that described Nashi's members as bandits and nationalists and compared the movement to the Hitler Youth in Nazi Germany. Nashi wants the contents of the article retracted, and it's demanding 500,000 rubles, that's about $17,000 US, in damages. Here's a line that will send a chill across the U.S. newspaper industry, particularly since it was written in a newspaper. The 2-decade erosion in newspaper circulation is looking more like an avalanche. Circulation in the U.S., which slid by 2% in 2005, 3% in 2006, and 4% in 2007, plummeted by more than 10% last year. The fall is being blamed on the economic downturn and the rise of the internet, and revenues and newsroom headcounts are also trending steeply downward. The biggest loser of readers was the San Francisco Chronicle. Its circulation was down by 28% last year. It's now less than half of what it was just 6 years ago. The American filmmaker Michael Moore has made some enemies in Venezuela, supporters of President Hugo Chavez.
Please welcome Michael Moore.
Moore did that while appearing on an American talk show, Jimmy Kimmel Live, which airs on ABC TV. Moore regaled the audience with an account of how he and Mr. Chavez shared a bottle or two of tequila while at the Venice Film Festival recently. Moore also said that he gave Chavez some advice on speech writing.
And so I turned on the TV last week when he spoke at the UN, and the first words out of his mouth were the exact words I'd written for him.
Chavez's supporters insist their man is a non-drinker and that he writes his own speeches. Their complaints about Moore's comments are another indication of how sensitive Chavistas are about what is said of their leader in American media. We're back after the break when the focus again will be on Ethiopia and the 1984 famine.